Students who had never watched a wrestling match still knew Mason's record, still understood that crossing him meant challenging someone who had built his entire identity around the concept of physical superiority. Connor Walsh served as Mason's primary lieutenant, a junior who had molded himself into a perfect reflection of his leader's aggressive confidence. Standing nearly as tall as Mason but lacking the natural athleticism, Connor compensated with a vicious enthusiasm for confrontation that sometimes made even Mason uncomfortable. Connor's family had moved to Westfield when he was in 8th grade, and he had immediately recognized that aligning himself with the wrestling team's future star was his path to social security. He studied Mason's mannerisms, copied his style of dress, and most importantly, learned to anticipate what Mason wanted before Mason had to ask for it. Kyle Stevens completed the trio with a different kind of value. Shorter than his friends but stockier, Kyle brought a calculating intelligence to their group dynamic that Mason and Connor sometimes lacked. Kyle understood the school's social networks in ways that went beyond simple physical intimidation. He knew which teachers would look the other way during hallway incidents, which students had enough social capital to be dangerous if they decided to speak up, and most importantly, how to escalate situations without creating evidence that could lead to serious consequences. Kyle's father was a lawyer in town, which gave the group an additional layer of protection that everyone understood, but nobody discussed directly. The three had formed their alliance during freshman year, when Mason's wrestling potential was already obvious, but his social dominance hadn't yet been established. They had learned together how to navigate the complex ecosystem of high school politics, how to build fear without creating rebellion, and how to maintain their position at the top of the hierarchy through careful application of pressure and intimidation. By senior year, their system had become so refined that most students couldn't even identify specific incidents of bullying. The atmosphere of threat was just part of the environment at Westfield High, as natural and unquestioned as the mountain air. Mason's reputation extended far beyond the wrestling room. His family owned the largest construction company in the valley, which meant that many students' fathers worked for the Parker family in some capacity. Economic relationships translated into social ones, creating a web of connections that made challenging Mason feel like challenging the entire community structure. Teachers knew that upsetting Mason might mean upset parents, canceled construction projects, and conversations with school board members who depended on Parker Construction for various municipal contracts. The wrestling coach, Marcus Webb, had built his entire program around Mason's abilities and had no interest in jeopardizing that success by addressing character issues that didn't directly impact athletic performance. Coach Webb had played college football before a knee injury ended his career, and he understood that champions needed a certain level of aggression to succeed. In his mind, Mason's dominance outside the wrestling room was just evidence of the competitive drive that made him so successful during matches. Any complaints about Mason's behavior were filtered through Coach Webb's assumption that winners naturally made enemies among people who couldn't handle losing. The first direct encounter between Mason and Ryan had occurred in early February, during the dead of winter when cabin fever made everyone at Westfield High more aggressive than usual. Ryan was walking to his last period computer science class when he accidentally bumped into Mason near the trophy cases. The collision was purely accidental, the result of Ryan checking his phone while walking and not noticing Mason examining his own wrestling trophies. But Mason's reaction suggested something far more intentional. Mason's hand shot out and grabbed Ryan's shoulder, spinning him around with enough force to make Ryan stumble. The hallway wasn't crowded, but the few students present immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere and slowed their pace to watch what would happen next. Mason's eyes narrowed as he studied Ryan's face, taking in the startled expression behind wire-rimmed glasses and the way Ryan's body language immediately shifted into defensive mode. "Watch where you're going, computer boy," Mason said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the gathering spectators. Ryan mumbled an apology and tried to step around Mason, but Connor and Kyle had materialized as if summoned, creating a loose semicircle that blocked Ryan's escape routes. The positioning looked casual to any teachers who might glance in their direction, but Ryan understood immediately that he was trapped. "You're Ryan Mitchell, right?" Mason continued, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "David Mitchell's kid. I heard your dad's some kind of soldier or something." The way Mason said soldier carried a subtle mockery, as if military service was somehow less impressive than high school wrestling championships. Ryan nodded carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading, but certain that any response could make things worse. Mason circled Ryan slowly, like a predator, evaluating prey, while Connor and Kyle maintained their positions. "Must be tough, having a dad who thinks he's so tough while his son is." Mason gestured vaguely at Ryan's entire appearance, whatever this is supposed to be. The insult was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that Mason had perfected over years of practice. Not quite severe enough to justify a strong response, but painful enough to establish dominance. Ryan felt his jaw clench involuntarily, the first crack in the careful emotional control his father had taught him to maintain during confrontations. Mason noticed the reaction immediately, filing it away for future reference. "Sensitive about Daddy, huh? That's interesting." Mason stepped closer, using his height advantage to force Ryan to crane his neck upward. "Maybe we should have a longer conversation about this sometime, when there's more privacy." The promise of future harassment hung in the air like a threat, and Ryan understood that his carefully maintained invisibility had officially ended. Mason had identified him as a target, which meant that every day at Westfield High was about to become exponentially more difficult. The encounter ended when the bell rang for final period, dispersing the small crowd and giving Ryan an excuse to escape to the computer lab. But as he walked away, Ryan could feel Mason's eyes following him, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The demand came 3 weeks later, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Ryan was in the computer lab during lunch, working on code for a website he was building for his grandmother's knitting circle, when Mason Parker walked through the door like he owned the place. The lab was supposed to be a sanctuary, a neutral zone where academic pursuits took precedence over social warfare, but Mason's presence immediately transformed the atmosphere into something predatory and dangerous. Mrs. Peterson was at a faculty meeting, leaving the lab unsupervised, except for the handful of students who genuinely used the space for legitimate projects. When Mason entered, followed closely by Connor and Kyle, the other students quickly gathered their belongings and found excuses to leave. Within minutes, Ryan found himself alone with the 3 wrestlers in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than its actual dimensions. Mason approached Ryan's workstation with the deliberate pace of someone savoring a moment they had been planning for weeks. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside Ryan, close enough that his presence felt invasive, but not so close that it would look threatening to anyone who might glance through the lab's windows. Connor positioned himself near the door, ostensibly looking at a poster about internet safety, but actually serving as a lookout. Kyle wandered toward the teacher's desk, examining the various certificates and awards that decorated Mrs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Peterson's workspace. "Nice setup you've got here, Mitchell," Mason said, his eyes scanning the multiple monitors displaying Ryan's code. "I've been hearing interesting things about your computer skills. Apparently, you're some kind of genius with this stuff." The compliment felt dangerous, loaded with implications that Ryan couldn't quite decipher. Mason had never shown any interest in academic achievement before, which made his sudden fascination with Ryan's programming abilities deeply suspicious. Ryan minimized his browser windows and turned slightly in his chair, trying to read Mason's expression for clues about his intentions. "I wouldn't say genius. I just like working with computers." His voice carried the careful neutrality he had learned to use during potentially volatile conversations, giving away nothing that could be used against him later. Mason leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be modest. I heard you helped Mr. Johnson recover his entire gradebook when the system crashed last month. Saved him from having to reconstruct 6 weeks of grades manually. That sounds pretty genius level to me." The fact that Mason knew about Ryan's quiet assistance to the chemistry teacher was troubling. It suggested that Mason had been paying closer attention to Ryan's activities than Ryan had realized. "I just restored it from a backup," Ryan replied, though he knew the situation had been more complex than that. The system failure had corrupted multiple files, and Ryan had spent hours writing custom recovery scripts to salvage the data. But admitting the full extent of his involvement would only encourage whatever Mason was building toward. Kyle wandered over from Mrs. Peterson's desk, carrying a stack of handouts about digital citizenship and internet safety. "These are interesting," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "All this stuff about ethical computer use and responsible digital behavior. Real inspiring stuff." He dropped the papers back onto the desk with deliberate carelessness, sending a few sheets floating to the floor. Mason's smile widened as he watched Kyle's performance. "Ethics are important, Mitchell. Wouldn't want anyone to think we were asking you to do anything inappropriate." The emphasis on inappropriate carried a warning that made Ryan's stomach tighten with apprehension. Whatever Mason wanted, it was definitely going to cross ethical lines. Connor spoke up from his position near the door, his voice carrying the forced casualness of someone delivering rehearsed lines. "Speaking of ethics, we heard about this situation with some of the college applications. Real unfortunate stuff." Ryan had no idea what Connor was referring to, but the way all 3 wrestlers were watching his reaction suggested it was significant. "See, here's the thing," Mason continued, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than outright aggression. "Some of our teammates are having issues with their college application essays. Technical issues, you might say. Computer problems that are making it hard for them to submit their applications on time." Ryan understood immediately where this was heading, but he forced himself to remain calm and wait for the explicit request. His father had taught him that in any negotiation or confrontation, the person who spoke first usually lost whatever advantage they might have had. Mason was building towards something specific, and Ryan needed to understand the full scope of the demand before responding. "These aren't just any applications," Kyle added, settling into a third chair to complete the circle around Ryan. "We're talking about Division I scholarships. Full rides to schools that could change these guys' entire lives. The kind of opportunities that don't come around twice." The implication was clear. Whatever they were asking Ryan to do was supposedly for a noble cause, helping deserving athletes achieve their dreams. Mason nodded sympathetically, as if the situation genuinely troubled him. "The thing is, some of these guys aren't exactly what you'd call natural writers. Wrestling talent doesn't always translate to essay skills, you know. And the application deadlines are coming up fast, like really fast." He paused, letting the time pressure sink in before continuing. "We heard you're pretty good with words, too. All that computer stuff requires logical thinking, attention to detail, ability to communicate complex ideas clearly." Ryan felt his hands clench involuntarily as the full picture became clear. They weren't asking him to fix computer problems or help with technical difficulties. They wanted him to write college application essays for wrestlers who couldn't produce their own work. The request was academic fraud on a scale that could destroy multiple futures if discovered, including Ryan's own. "You want me to write essays for other people?" Ryan said flatly, abandoning any pretense of not understanding their request. That's cheating. It's fraud. If any college found out, everyone involved would be banned from ever applying again. Connor laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Cheating is such an ugly word. The wrestling room at Westfield High was silent except for the sound of Ryan, Mitchell's labored breathing, and the creak of the climbing rope around his neck. Mason Parker's hands tightened their grip as he whispered threats that would haunt most 17-year-olds for the rest of their lives. But Mason had no idea that the quiet kid gasping for air beneath him had been trained by someone who'd survived far worse than high school bullies. What happened next would become the most talked about incident in Westfield's history, and Mason Parker would never make the mistake of underestimating anyone ever again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ryan Mitchell had perfected the art of being forgettable. At 17, he stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with sandy brown hair that never seemed to cooperate and wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly pushed up his nose. His oversized hoodies and worn jeans hung loosely on his thin frame, making him appear even smaller than he actually was. For the past 2.5 years at Westfield High School, Ryan had maintained a carefully calculated invisibility that allowed him to navigate the hallways without drawing unwanted attention from the mountain town's most notorious bullies. Westfield High sat nestled in the Colorado Rockies, where winter seemed to last 9 months of the year and the school's identity revolved entirely around its championship wrestling program. The trophy cases lining the main hallway showcased decades of state titles, and every conversation seemed to center around who was ranked where and which colleges were scouting which athletes. For students like Ryan, who had never set foot on a wrestling mat, school felt like living in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. Ryan's daily routine was precisely planned to minimize contact with the wrestling team and their followers. He arrived at school exactly 7 minutes before first bell, when most athletes were still in the locker room preparing for morning practice. His locker was strategically chosen in the least trafficked hallway, far from the gymnasium where the popular crowd congregated. Lunch was spent in the computer lab, ostensibly working on programming projects, but really just hiding behind monitors while eating sandwiches his grandmother packed every morning. The computer lab had become Ryan's sanctuary over the years. While other students saw rows of outdated machines and flickering fluorescent lights, Ryan saw possibilities. He had taught himself 3 programming languages by the time he was 15, could navigate network systems with an intuitive understanding. That impressed even the school's IT administrator, and had quietly helped several teachers recover lost files without ever asking for recognition. Technology made sense to Ryan in a way that social hierarchies never would. Mrs. Peterson, the computer science teacher, had taken notice of Ryan's abilities early in his sophomore year. She often stayed after hours to discuss programming concepts with him, and Ryan suspected she understood his need for a safe space during lunch periods. The lab was always open for students during free periods, but somehow it seemed like other students rarely ventured in when Ryan was there. Whether this was coincidence or Mrs. Peterson's careful management, Ryan was grateful for the solitude. Ryan's home life was equally quiet, but far more complex than his classmates could have imagined. He lived with his grandmother in a modest house on the outskirts of Westfield, where the mountain views were spectacular and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. His father, Staff Sergeant David Mitchell, was deployed overseas with the Special Operations Unit, serving his 4th tour in places Ryan wasn't allowed to know about. Phone calls home were infrequent and brief, usually consisting of David asking about school and Ryan providing carefully edited summaries that emphasized academics and omitted any mention of social difficulties. What Ryan never mentioned to anyone at school was how those brief phone calls often included lessons that went far beyond typical father-son conversations. David Mitchell was a Navy SEAL who had spent 15 years in some of the world's most dangerous situations, and he had made sure his son understood that survival skills weren't just for combat zones. During summer visits before his current deployment, David had taught Ryan techniques that most teenagers would never need to know: how to read a room for potential threats, how to escape from restraints using nothing but physics and leverage, how to remain calm when adrenaline tried to take over, how to turn an opponent's strength against them when direct confrontation wasn't possible. Ryan's grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, was a retired nurse who had spent 30 years working in emergency rooms across Colorado. She understood trauma in ways that most people never would, and she recognized the signs of a teenager who was carrying burdens he shouldn't have to bear alone. Eleanor never pushed Ryan to talk about school, but she made sure he knew that their house was a place where he could be completely himself. She had converted the basement into a workshop where Ryan could tinker with electronics and practice the technical skills his father had taught him during those summer visits. The basement workshop was where Ryan spent most of his free time. Surrounded by circuit boards, old computers he'd rebuilt from scrap parts, and equipment that would have looked more at home in a military training facility than a teenager's bedroom. David had shipped certain items home before his deployment, telling Eleanor they were for Ryan's education. The climbing rope, tactical knots reference guide, and basic survival gear looked innocent enough to neighbors who occasionally visited, but Ryan understood their real purpose. His father was preparing him for situations that a quiet computer geek should never have to face. Despite his careful planning and low profile, Ryan couldn't completely avoid the attention of Westfield's predators. Mason Parker had noticed him early in the school year, not because Ryan had done anything to stand out, but because Ryan's very invisibility made him an appealing target. Bullies like Mason operated on a simple principle: find the weakest prey and make examples of them to maintain fear among potential future victims. Ryan's small stature, academic focus, and obvious avoidance of confrontation checked every box on Mason's list of ideal targets. The first few incidents had been minor. A shoulder check in the hallway that sent Ryan's books flying. Snide comments about his clothes or his glasses that were just loud enough for nearby students to hear. Questions about whether he'd ever been in a fight, delivered with the kind of smirk that suggested Mason already knew the answer. Ryan had absorbed each incident without reaction, hoping that his lack of response would make him less interesting as a target. He was wrong. Mason Parker commanded Westfield High School the way a king ruled his kingdom, with absolute authority, and the unwavering loyalty of subjects who understood that challenging him, facing consequences they couldn't handle. At 18, Mason stood 6 feet 2 inches of pure muscle, sculpted by years of intensive wrestling training, and a genetic lottery that had blessed him with natural athleticism. His broad shoulders filled out his Letterman jacket like it was custom-tailored, and his confident stride through the hallways parted crowds of students who instinctively moved aside without even realizing they were doing it. The wrestling mat was Mason's domain, where he had established himself as the most dominant athlete in Westfield's recent history. 3 consecutive state championships hung on his bedroom wall, and college scouts from Division I programs called his house so frequently that his mother had started screening calls. His signature move, a devastating takedown that coaches called the Parker Slam, had ended more matches in the first period than any other wrestler in the state. But Mason's real talent wasn't just his ability to physically dominate opponents on the mat. His true gift was understanding exactly how to use that physical dominance to control every aspect of life at Westfield High. Wrestling culture permeated every corner of the school, from the motivational posters lining the hallways to the way teachers spoke about discipline and mental toughness in their classrooms. The wrestling team occupied a special tier in the social hierarchy, above even the football players who struggled to achieve the same level of individual recognition. Wrestling was about one-on-one combat, about proving personal superiority in The most primitive way possible, and Mason Parker had never lost that kind of personal battle. The request sounded perfectly reasonable, the kind of peer-to-peer learning that teachers were always encouraging. Ryan felt his stomach drop as he realized the trap Mason had constructed. Refusing to demonstrate his programming skills would make him appear uncooperative and antisocial in front of a teacher who had always supported him. But agreeing to the demonstration would give Mason a platform to humiliate him in front of an audience while maintaining plausible deniability about his true intentions. Mrs. Peterson smiled with the enthusiasm of an educator who genuinely believed in the value of sharing knowledge. What a wonderful idea! Ryan is incredibly talented, and I'm sure he'd be happy to show you some of his work. She gestured toward the main projection screen at the front of the lab. Ryan, why don't you pull up that website you've been building? I'm sure your classmates would be impressed by your progress. Ryan moved toward the teacher's computer with the sensation of walking toward his own execution. Behind him, he could hear the wrestlers settling into chairs and desks, their presence filling every corner of the lab with anticipatory energy. Mason positioned himself directly in Ryan's line of sight, his expression carrying a promise of humiliation. That made Ryan's hands shake as he connected his laptop to the projection system. The website Ryan had been building for his grandmother's knitting circle appeared on the large screen, and he immediately realized how it would appear to a room full of teenage athletes. The pastel color scheme, carefully chosen to appeal to elderly women, looked childish and feminine on the lab's professional display. The navigation menu included sections for cozy patterns, tea time recipes, and friendship corner, each phrase designed to create a warm, welcoming atmosphere for his grandmother's friends, but absolutely devastating when viewed by the most aggressively masculine students at Westfield High. Connor was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying just the right note of confused disappointment. This is what you've been working on all semester? A knitting website? The question was delivered with surgical precision, implying that Ryan had been wasting his time on trivial pursuits, while more important students focused on serious activities. Kyle joined the attack with apparent reluctance, as if he hated to criticize but felt compelled by honesty. I mean, it's very colorful, very crafty. The pause before crafty was perfectly timed, allowing the word to hang in the air with all its implications about Ryan's masculinity and social priorities. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the shift in atmosphere but not understanding its source, tried to defend her student. Ryan has demonstrated exceptional technical skills in building this site from scratch. The coding is quite sophisticated, regardless of the subject matter. But her support only made things worse, highlighting the contrast between Ryan's academic achievements and his social isolation. Mason delivered the killing blow with the timing of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes many times before. It's definitely sophisticated, he agreed, his voice carrying just enough sincerity to avoid sounding directly mocking. I'm just wondering if maybe your talents might be better used on projects that could benefit more people. Like the wrestling team's website, for example. We've been looking for someone with real technical skills to help us showcase our championship history. The suggestion appeared generous on the surface, but Ryan understood the subtext immediately. Mason was offering him one more chance to cooperate, to use his abilities in service of the wrestling team's glory, with the clear implication that refusing this public opportunity would have serious consequences. The entire room was watching, waiting to see whether Ryan would accept Mason's olive branch or continue his stubborn resistance to collaboration. Ryan looked at the knitting website displayed on the screen, then at Mrs. Peterson's encouraging expression, then at the crowd of wrestlers whose presence had transformed his sanctuary into an arena. He understood that his response in this moment would determine not just his immediate future, but his entire remaining experience at Westfield High School. Mason had engineered a perfect trap, offering apparent generosity while making the consequences of refusal obvious to everyone present. "I appreciate the offer," Ryan said carefully, his voice barely carrying to the back of the room, "but I'm committed to finishing this project first." The silence that followed felt like the moment before. An avalanche when the mountain holds its breath before unleashing forces that will reshape the entire landscape below. The systematic harassment that followed, Ryan's public rejection of Mason's offer, transformed Westfield High into a psychological battlefield where Ryan found himself constantly under siege. Mason and his crew had elevated their campaign from subtle intimidation to overt persecution, creating an atmosphere of dread that permeated every aspect of Ryan's school experience. They had apparently decided that making an example of Ryan was more important than maintaining their usual facade of plausible deniability. The attacks came in waves throughout the following weeks, each incident carefully designed to isolate Ryan further from potential allies while demonstrating Mason's absolute control over the school's social ecosystem. Ryan's locker was repeatedly jammed with foreign objects that required maintenance intervention to remove. His backpack disappeared from classrooms, only to be found hours later in locations that suggested someone with master key access had planted it there. Anonymous notes appeared in his textbooks, crude drawings and messages that escalated from juvenile insults to graphic threats about what would happen if he continued his stubborn resistance. More disturbing was the way other students began avoiding Ryan entirely, as if his persecution was contagious and proximity to him might attract similar attention. Former lab partners found excuses to work with different people. Students who had occasionally nodded acknowledgement in hallways now looked through him as if he had become invisible again. But this time the invisibility felt like abandonment rather than protection. Even Mrs. Peterson seemed uncomfortable around Ryan, her usual warmth replaced by a professional distance that suggested she had received guidance about maintaining appropriate boundaries. The physical escalation began during gym class, when Coach Martinez assigned wrestling units that coincidentally placed Ryan in direct competition with members of Mason's crew. Ryan had always dreaded physical education, using medical excuses whenever possible to avoid activities that highlighted his size disadvantage. But the wrestling unit was mandatory for all students, regardless of athletic ability or personal preferences. Coach Martinez claimed the unit was designed to teach basic self-defense skills, but Ryan suspected Mason had influenced the curriculum to create opportunities for legal physical dominance. Connor Walsh was Ryan's first assigned opponent, a matchup that appeared fair on paper since they were roughly the same weight class. But Connor had years of actual wrestling experience compared to Ryan's complete ignorance of the sport's techniques. The match lasted less than 30 seconds, with Connor executing a perfectly legal takedown that left Ryan gasping on the mat while trying to understand what had happened to his equilibrium. Connor's follow-up pin was technically sound and entirely within the rules, but the way he applied pressure to Ryan's chest made breathing difficult and sent a clear message about what would happen if Ryan continued resisting Mason's authority. The pattern repeated throughout the week with different opponents, each match ending in Ryan's swift defeat while teaching him painful lessons about the reality of physical confrontation. Kyle Stevens proved surprisingly technical despite his smaller size, using leverage and timing to make Ryan feel helpless and clumsy. Other wrestlers took turns demonstrating their superiority, each victory adding to Ryan's growing understanding that his academic intelligence meant nothing in a world governed by physical strength and aggressive confidence. Mason himself never participated directly in these demonstrations, preferring to observe from the sidelines while offering coaching advice to his teammates about proper technique and safety considerations. His presence at every match sent a clear message about who was orchestrating Ryan's education and powerlessness, but his hands-off approach made it impossible to accuse him of direct involvement in what appeared to be legitimate athletic instruction. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late March, when winter was finally loosening its grip on the Colorado mountains, and students were beginning to think about spring break plans. Ryan had stayed after school to work on a computer programming project, hoping that the empty hallways would provide temporary refuge from the constant surveillance he had endured for weeks. The wrestling team had practice until 6 o'clock, which usually meant the academic areas of the school were safe for students who preferred solitude to social interaction. Ryan was walking toward the main exit when he realized the hallways weren't as empty as they appeared. Footsteps echoed behind him with the measured pace of hunters who had cornered their prey and could afford to savor the moment. He didn't need to turn around to recognize the swagger in those steps, but when he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Mason, Connor, and Kyle approaching with expressions that suggested their patience had finally reached its limit. "Mitchell," Mason called out, his voice echoing off the metal lockers in a way that made the hallway feel like an echo chamber. "We need to have that conversation we've been putting off." The casual tone couldn't disguise the underlying menace, and Ryan understood immediately that this encounter would be different from their previous confrontations. Ryan quickened his pace toward the exit, but Kyle had anticipated this strategy and emerged from a side hallway to block his path. The coordination suggested they had planned this ambush carefully, choosing a time and location where administrative oversight would be minimal and Ryan's options for escape would be limited. The main office was closed, the custodial staff was working in distant sections of the building, and most teachers had left for the weekend. "Running away again?" Connor asked with mock disappointment as he positioned himself to cut off Ryan's retreat toward the computer lab. "That's becoming a real pattern with you, isn't it?" The observation was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that had become Connor's specialty, designed to make Ryan feel like his survival instincts were character flaws rather than reasonable responses to genuine threats. Mason approached with the deliberate confidence of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes many times before and knew exactly how they would unfold. "Here's the thing, Mitchell. We've been more than patient with your attitude problem, but our patience isn't unlimited. Some of our teammates are starting to think we're going soft, letting a nobody like you disrespect the team without consequences." Ryan found himself backed against a wall of lockers, the metal cold against his shoulders as the three wrestlers formed a loose semicircle that eliminated his remaining escape routes. The positioning looked casual enough to avoid suspicion if any adults happened to walk by, but Ryan understood that he was effectively trapped in a situation that could escalate beyond his ability to handle safely. "We're going to try one more time to help you understand how things work around here," Kyle said, pulling a length of climbing rope from his gym bag with practiced casualness. The rope was standard equipment for the school's fitness program, innocent enough that its presence wouldn't raise questions, but Ryan's stomach dropped as he realized its intended purpose. Mason stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have been. "See, the problem is that you think you're special. You think your computer skills and your daddy's military service make you different from everyone else. But here's what we're going to teach you today." Without warning, Connor grabbed Ryan's arms while Kyle moved behind him with the rope. Ryan felt the rough fibers loop around his neck before he could react, the sudden pressure cutting off his air supply and sending panic shooting through his nervous system. His hands flew to his throat instinctively, trying to create space between the rope and his windpipe, but Kyle's grip was practiced and efficient. "Nothing personal," Mason said, his face inches from Ryan's as the rope tightened incrementally. "But everyone at Westfield needs to understand what happens when someone thinks they're too good to help their classmates. Consider this a public service announcement." The pressure increased gradually, calculated to cause distress without leaving permanent damage, but Ryan's vision began to blur at the edges as his oxygen supply diminished. His father's voice echoed in his memory from countless training sessions, reminding him that panic was the enemy in any survival situation and that clear thinking was the only path to escape. Ryan's body suddenly relaxed in a way that confused his attackers, the apparent submission making them loosen their grip slightly. In that split second of reduced pressure, Ryan executed a movement his father had drilled into him hundreds of times during summer training sessions. He stepped backward into Kyle's space while simultaneously grabbing the rope with both hands, using his body weight to create slack and then spinning sharply to the left. The maneuver caught Kyle completely off guard, and Ryan's elbow connected with Kyle's solar plexus with enough force to double him over and release the rope entirely. Connor tried to grab Ryan's arm, but Ryan had already shifted his weight forward and delivered a precise strike to Connor's wrist that numbed his entire hand and made him stumble backward into the lockers. Mason stared in shock as Ryan straightened up, the rope falling harmlessly to the floor while Ryan's entire demeanor transformed from victim to something far more dangerous. Years of Navy SEAL training had been compressed into muscle memory that activated the moment Ryan's life was genuinely threatened, and the quiet computer geek had disappeared entirely. "My father didn't just serve overseas," Ryan said calmly, his voice carrying a new authority that made all three wrestlers take instinctive steps backward. "He's a Navy SEAL, and he made sure I knew how to handle situations exactly like this one." Ryan's stance had shifted into something balanced and ready, his hands positioned in ways that suggested violence was not only possible but probable. Kyle was still gasping for breath. Connor was shaking feeling back into his numb hand, and Mason was staring at Ryan with the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated his opponent's capabilities. The power dynamic in the hallway had shifted completely, and for the first time in his high school career, Mason Parker was looking up at someone who wasn't afraid of him. "Here's how this is going to work," Ryan continued, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped hiding who he really was. "You're going to leave me alone. You're going to leave everyone else alone. And you're going to spend the rest of your time at Westfield learning what it feels like to be afraid." The confrontation ended when security footage from the hallway cameras found its way to the principal's office, showing clear evidence of assault that resulted in suspensions and criminal charges that destroyed Mason's college wrestling prospects forever. Ryan became the student other victims came to for help, and Westfield High learned that sometimes the quietest people are the most dangerous when they finally decide to stop hiding. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. We prefer to think of it as collaboration, teamwork. You help the team helps you. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Refusing to help would mean facing consequences that Ryan probably couldn't imagine. Mason leaned forward, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Look, Mitchell, we're not talking about writing essays for random people. These are good guys, athletes who've worked their asses off for 4 years to earn these opportunities. The only thing standing between them and their dreams is some arbitrary writing requirement that has nothing to do with their actual abilities." "Writing skills matter for college," Ryan replied, though he could hear his own voice getting smaller as the pressure mounted. "Essays help admissions committees understand who applicants really are. If someone can't write their own essay, maybe they're not ready for college-level work." Kyle shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "That's pretty cold, Ryan. These guys have families depending on these scholarships. Some of them are the first in their families who might go to college. You're really going to let your high and mighty principles destroy their futures?" The emotional manipulation was expertly applied, designed to make Ryan feel guilty for having standards. But Ryan understood that giving in to this demand would only lead to bigger requests later. If he wrote essays now, they'd expect him to hack grade systems later, or create fake transcripts, or whatever other academic fraud they could imagine. There was no such thing as helping just once with people like Mason Parker. "I can't do it," Ryan said quietly. "Find someone else." The temperature in the computer lab seemed to drop several degrees as Mason's friendly facade finally slipped completely. His eyes hardened into something cold and calculating, and Ryan realized he had just made a very dangerous enemy. The retaliation began the next morning with surgical precision, targeting Ryan's most vulnerable moments with the calculated cruelty of predators who had perfected their craft over years of practice. Mason Parker didn't believe in explosive outbursts or dramatic confrontations that might attract administrative attention. Instead, he orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare designed to systematically dismantle Ryan's carefully constructed invisibility while making each incident appear coincidental to any adult observers. Ryan's first indication that his refusal had consequences came during second-period chemistry, when Mr. Johnson assigned lab partners for a complex experiment involving volatile reactions. Ryan typically partnered with Sarah Chun, a quiet girl, who shared his preference for academic focus over social interaction. They had developed an efficient working relationship over the semester, communicating through shared glances and minimal conversation, while consistently producing the best results in the class. But when Ryan arrived at his usual lab station, he found Connor Walsh already setting up equipment with deliberate slowness. Sarah caught Ryan's eye from across the room, her expression apologetic as she gestured toward Mason, who had positioned himself at her usual station. The message was clear. Mason had engineered the partner assignments to isolate Ryan with Connor while claiming Sarah for himself. "Hope you don't mind the change," Connor said with false cheerfulness as Ryan reluctantly approached the lab bench. Sarah looked like she needed a challenge today, and Mason's always been curious about chemistry. Across the room, Mason was leaning over Sarah's shoulder, ostensibly examining their shared textbook, but actually using his physical presence to make her visibly uncomfortable. The experiment required precise measurements and careful timing, skills that Connor either lacked or deliberately ignored. He consistently added too much of each chemical, mixed solutions too aggressively, and ignored Ryan's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage their work. When their beaker cracked from thermal shock, releasing acrid smoke that triggered the lab's ventilation system, Connor stepped back with his hands raised in mock surrender. "Oops," Connor announced loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Guess my partner didn't explain the procedure clearly enough." The accusation was absurd since Ryan had been trying to correct Connor's mistakes throughout the experiment. But the damage was done. Mr. Johnson approached their station with obvious irritation, and Ryan found himself accepting responsibility for the failed experiment, rather than engaging in a public argument that would only make things worse. The incident established a pattern that continued throughout the morning. In English class, Kyle Stevens managed to position himself behind Ryan during a group discussion about literary themes. Every time Ryan attempted to contribute to the conversation, Kyle would cough loudly or shuffle papers, disrupting Ryan's comments just enough to make him appear hesitant and unprepared. When Mrs. Rodriguez called on Ryan directly, Kyle knocked his pencil case off his desk, sending pens and pencils clattering across the floor in a distraction that left Ryan stammering through his response. By lunchtime, Ryan understood that Mason's crew had coordinated their efforts across multiple classes, creating a web of subtle harassment that would be nearly impossible to document or report. Each individual incident appeared minor, the kind of typical teenage clumsiness or inconsideration that teachers dealt with dozens of times per day. But the cumulative effect was devastating to Ryan's sense of security and his ability to function normally in the academic environment where he had always excelled. The escalation came during lunch period, when Ryan made the mistake of trying to maintain his normal routine by eating in the computer lab. He had assumed that Mrs. Peterson's return from her meeting would restore the lab's status as neutral territory, but Mason had apparently anticipated this strategy. Ryan was halfway through his sandwich when the lab door opened to admit not just Mason and his crew, but 6 additional wrestlers who filled the space with an overwhelming masculine presence that immediately transformed the atmosphere. Mrs. Peterson looked up from her desk with obvious surprise, her eyes moving from Mason to the crowd of athletes who had suddenly invaded her usually quiet domain. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" she asked, her tone carrying the authority of a teacher who wasn't easily intimidated, but also wasn't entirely sure how to handle an unprecedented situation. Mason stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything by school staff. "We're really interested in learning more about computer programming, Mrs. Peterson. Ryan here was telling us about some of the amazing projects he's been working on, and we thought maybe he could give us a demonstration."